The attraction principle nobody talks about. The beginning. Every person you meet leaves an invisible impression on your mind. Most disappear within hours. Some linger for days. And a rare few stay with you for years. Have you ever wondered why? Why can you forget the face of someone you spoke with yesterday, yet vividly remember a conversation from years ago with someone who wasn't especially attractive, wealthy, or powerful? Most people believe the answer is charisma. Others say it's confidence. Some insist it's status. But psychology points towards something much deeper. There is an invisible principle operating beneath almost every human interaction. One that quietly determines who earns your attention, who gains your trust, and who slowly becomes unforgettable. The strange part is that almost no one talks about it. Instead, we're taught a different story. We're told to become more successful, to become more attractive, to speak more confidently, to dominate conversations, to impress people. As if attraction were a reward given only to those who collect enough achievements. But if that were true, the world wouldn't look the way it does. You've probably met someone who wasn't exceptionally handsome, wealthy, or charismatic, yet people naturally enjoyed being around them. You've also met people who seemed to have everything: looks, confidence, money, and still struggled to build meaningful relationships. That contradiction tells us something important. Human connection doesn't begin with appearance. It doesn't begin with status. It doesn't even begin with confidence. It begins inside the brain. Because before someone decides whether they like you, before they decide whether they trust you, before they even become aware of how they feel, their brain has already started making predictions about you. Every second of every day, your mind acts like a prediction machine. Without your awareness, it constantly asks questions. What happens next? Can this person be trusted? Will this conversation be worth my attention? Is there anything here I haven't already seen before? Most of these predictions are so automatic that we never notice them. When reality matches our expectations, the brain saves energy. Nothing feels remarkable. Nothing stands out. The interaction fades almost immediately. But every now and then, someone says something unexpected. Someone notices a detail everyone else ignored. Someone responds with unusual calm when everyone expects anger. Someone listens when everyone else waits for their turn to speak. And suddenly, your brain pays attention. Not because that person is perfect, but because they violated one of your expectations in a positive way. That moment is far more powerful than most people realize. Psychologists call this a prediction error. Your brain expected one outcome. Reality delivered another. When that happens, your attention immediately sharpens. The brain begins asking a new question. This is different. Should I learn from it? That simple question has shaped human survival for thousands of years. Our ancestors who noticed unexpected opportunities or unexpected dangers were more likely to survive. Today, the same mechanism quietly shapes your relationships. It influences who you remember, who you admire, who you trust, and sometimes who you fall in love with. The remarkable thing is that most people spend their lives trying to become impressive. Very few learn how to become memorable. Those are not the same thing. Impressive people often attract admiration. Memorable people attract attention. And attention always comes first. Think back to your own life. The teacher you still remember. The stranger whose kindness stayed with you. The friend who always seemed calming to be around. What made them unforgettable? It probably wasn't a dramatic moment. More likely, it was a series of small moments. Moments that quietly challenged your expectations. Perhaps they remembered something you mentioned weeks earlier. Perhaps they asked a question no one else had asked. Perhaps they gave you their full attention in a world where everyone else was distracted. Individually, those moments seem insignificant. Together, they change how the brain remembers a person. This is where almost every piece of modern advice gets the order wrong. It tells you to become valuable first. Then people will notice you. But attention rarely works that way. People don't notice value first. They notice difference. Only after someone captures your attention does your brain begin searching for reasons to justify why they matter. In other words, attention comes first, meaning comes second. That's why the loudest person in the room isn't always the most influential. That's why quiet people sometimes command enormous respect without speaking very much. That's why genuine presence can feel more powerful than endless confidence. Because attention follows psychology, not appearances. And once you understand the principle behind attention, you'll begin seeing it everywhere. In friendships, in leadership, in business, in storytelling, even in the content you choose to watch online. Every successful communicator understands one thing. The brain ignores what it expects. It remembers what surprises it. Not through shock, not through manipulation, but through meaningful difference. The question is, what kind of difference actually creates lasting attraction? And why do so many people spend years chasing confidence when the answer has been quietly hidden inside the human brain all along? That's where the real story begins. The biggest lie about attraction. If you ask 10 different people what makes someone attractive, you'll probably hear 10 different answers. Confidence, money, looks, humor, status, intelligence. And while each of these can influence how people see you, they all share the same problem. They're treated as causes when they're often just consequences. Imagine meeting two strangers. The first walks into the room wearing expensive clothes, speaks confidently, and seems successful. Almost everyone notices them. The second is quieter. They don't demand attention. They simply observe. At first glance, you might assume the first person has the advantage. But after an hour, something interesting happens. The loud conversation starts to feel predictable. The jokes become repetitive. The confidence begins to sound rehearsed. Meanwhile, the quieter person speaks only occasionally, but every question they ask feels thoughtful. Every observation adds something new. When they listen, they don't simply wait for their turn to speak. They make the other person feel understood. Without realizing it, people begin turning toward them, not because they're louder, but because every interaction feels unexpectedly meaningful. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Human beings don't crave constant stimulation. They crave meaningful attention. There's a difference. Modern culture teaches us to perform, post more, talk more, show more, stand out at every opportunity. But the human nervous system wasn't designed to admire constant performance. It was designed to detect significance. When everything demands attention, almost nothing earns it. That's why genuine presence has become so rare. Think about the last conversation you had. How many times did someone glance at their phone? How many times did they interrupt before you finished speaking? How many times did they respond with advice before they truly understood the problem? None of these behaviors are unusual anymore. In fact, they've become normal. And that's exactly why someone who does the opposite feels unforgettable. This is one of psychology's greatest paradoxes. The standard for meaningful human interaction has quietly fallen. People expect distraction. They expect half-hearted listening. They expect conversations to stay on the surface. When someone breaks that pattern, not dramatically, but consistently, the brain notices. Not because perfection is attractive, because rarity is. This explains why simple acts often have surprisingly powerful effects. Remembering someone's name, following up on a conversation weeks later, looking someone in the eyes while they speak, allowing silence instead of rushing to fill it. These actions don't seem extraordinary, yet they violate modern expectations in subtle ways. And subtlety is often more powerful than spectacle. Large surprises create excitement. Small, repeated surprises create trust. That difference changes everything. Many people confuse attraction with excitement. They're not the same thing. Excitement is immediate. Attraction grows. Excitement fades quickly. Trust compounds over time. Someone can entertain you for 5 minutes and still leave no lasting impression. Someone else can make you feel deeply understood in a single conversation, and you'll remember them years later. That's because the brain isn't simply asking, "Was this interesting?" It's asking, "Should I remember this person?" Every meaningful interaction becomes another piece of evidence, another quiet signal, another reason for the brain to pay attention the next time. Eventually, attention becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes trust. And trust often becomes influence. This is why truly influential people rarely chase attention. They earn it. Not through manipulation, not through performance, but through consistency. The ancient Stoics understood something remarkably similar long before neuroscience gave it a name. They believed that character reveals itself through repeated actions, not isolated moments. Anyone can appear wise for an afternoon. Anyone can seem confident for a single conversation. But consistency cannot be faked forever. Eventually, every mask becomes too heavy to carry. Character remains, performance fades, and people notice the difference, even if they can't explain why. This is also where many people make a dangerous mistake. Once they hear that being unexpected attracts attention, They assume they should become unpredictable. So they become mysterious. Hot one day, cold the next. Generous one moment, distant the next. They mistake inconsistency for depth. But the brain experiences chaotic unpredictability very differently from meaningful surprise. One creates curiosity. The other creates stress. There's a reason abusive relationships often feel emotionally addictive. The constant uncertainty forces the brain into a state of hypervigilance. People confuse that emotional intensity with connection. But anxiety is not attraction, it's survival. Real attraction feels different. It creates safety alongside curiosity. You feel relaxed enough to be yourself, yet interested enough to keep learning more about the other person. That balance is incredibly rare, and because it's rare, it's memorable. The goal isn't to become impossible to understand. The goal is to become impossible to ignore for the right reasons. Quietly, consistently, authentically. So if confidence isn't the true foundation, if status isn't enough, if unpredictability can actually push people away, then what exactly is the hidden mechanism that causes certain people to become unforgettable? To answer that, we have to look deeper into one of the brain's most misunderstood chemicals. Not because it's the pleasure chemical, as it's often called, but because it's something far more powerful. It's the chemical that teaches your brain what deserves your attention. And understanding it changes the way you'll see every conversation for the rest of your life. The chemical that shapes attention. For years, dopamine has been called the brain's pleasure chemical. It's a simple explanation, and like many simple explanations, it's only partly true. If dopamine existed only to create pleasure, curiosity wouldn't exist. Neither would ambition. Neither would learning. The truth is far more interesting. Dopamine doesn't simply reward you for finding something enjoyable. It teaches your brain what deserves attention. Imagine walking through a forest thousands of years ago. Every sound matters. A rustling bush could be the wind, or it could be a predator. Ignoring the wrong signal could mean death. So your brain evolved a remarkable ability. Whenever reality differed from what it expected, it released chemicals that sharpened your focus. Not to make you happy, but to make you learn. This mechanism still exists today. The forest has changed. The brain hasn't. Instead of watching for predators, you're reading facial expressions, listening to someone's tone of voice, trying to decide whether a stranger is trustworthy, whether a friend is sincere, whether a conversation deserves your emotional investment. Every interaction becomes a series of tiny predictions. Will this person interrupt me? Will they judge me? Will they pretend to listen? Will they disappoint me? Most people unknowingly confirm those expectations. They check their phones while you're speaking. They wait impatiently for their turn to talk. They give advice nobody asked for. They hear your words, but never your meaning. None of it feels memorable because your brain expected it. Now imagine something different. You're speaking about a difficult moment in your life. Instead of interrupting, the other person lets the silence breathe. Instead of offering quick solutions, they ask one thoughtful question. A question that makes you realize they truly understood what you meant. In that instant, something changes. Your nervous system relaxes. Your attention sharpens. Without realizing it, you've become more interested in that person, not because they impressed you, because they surprised you in a meaningful way. This is the attraction principle hidden beneath ordinary conversation. People rarely remember those who speak the most. They remember those who make them feel most understood. Understanding is unexpected, especially in a world overflowing with distraction. Modern life has trained us to divide our attention, one eye on the conversation, one eye on the screen, half listening, half thinking, always preparing the next response instead of fully hearing the present one. Over time, this has quietly lowered everyone's expectations. People no longer expect complete attention. They hope for it, and hope is different. Hope means they've stopped assuming they'll receive it. That's why genuine presence has become one of the rarest forms of influence. Not because it's difficult, because it's uncommon. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that every person you meet is fighting battles you cannot see. He wasn't offering a strategy for popularity. He was describing a mindset. One built on observation instead of assumption, curiosity instead of judgment, presence instead of performance. Modern neuroscience and ancient Stoicism arrive at surprisingly similar conclusions. Attention changes people. Not forced attention, not manipulative attention. Real attention. The kind that says, "For these few moments, you matter more than my distractions." You can feel the difference immediately. So can everyone else. This is why the strongest communicators often appear calm. They're not rushing to prove themselves. They're trying to understand. Ironically, that makes people want to understand them in return. Influence becomes reciprocal. Respect becomes mutual. Trust begins to grow. And trust has a remarkable quality. Unlike excitement, it compounds. Think about someone you deeply trust. They probably didn't earn it through one extraordinary act. They earned it through dozens of ordinary moments. Showing up when they said they would. Remembering what mattered to you. Remaining calm during difficult conversations. Being consistent when inconsistency would have been easier. None of those moments make headlines, yet together they create something incredibly powerful. Predictability without boredom. Reliability without routine. Strength without intimidation. This is where attraction quietly transforms into something much deeper. Connection. The problem is that many people never reach this stage. They're too busy chasing techniques. Perfect conversation starters, body language tricks, psychological hacks. As if relationships were puzzles waiting to be solved. But human beings aren't equations. They're experiences. People don't remember how cleverly you spoke. They remember how they consistently felt around you. That's why authenticity eventually outperforms performance every time. Performance demands constant maintenance. Authenticity becomes effortless. Eventually, every rehearsed version of yourself becomes exhausting to sustain. The real version remains, and people sense the difference. The question then isn't, How do I become more interesting? A better question is, what expectations do people carry into every interaction? And how can I exceed them through genuine character rather than performance? That single shift changes everything, because once you stop trying to impress people, you become free to understand them. And strangely enough, that's often when people begin to remember you. But there is another side to this principle, a darker side. The same psychological mechanism that creates trust can also be used to create dependency. The same prediction errors that build healthy relationships can be manipulated to control people. Understanding that difference may be the most important lesson of all. The dark line between influence and manipulation. Every psychological mechanism has two directions. One builds, the other breaks. The same principle that creates trust can also create dependency. The same attention patterns that make someone feel understood can also be engineered to make them emotionally unstable. And the brain, at a chemical level, does not immediately distinguish between the two. It only responds to patterns. This is where prediction error becomes dangerous, because once you understand that attention is shaped by expectation and violation, it becomes possible to design experiences that keep people psychologically engaged for the wrong reasons. This is not theoretical. You see it everywhere. In conversations that feel emotionally addictive but unstable. In relationships that swing between warmth and distance. In personalities that feel magnetic one moment and confusing the next. The mechanism is always the same. Uncertainty increases attention. But not all attention is healthy. There is a critical difference between curiosity and anxiety. Curiosity feels open. Anxiety feels tight. Curiosity expands understanding. Anxiety narrows focus. Yet both are forms of heightened attention. This is why manipulation is so effective in the short term. It hijacks the same system that evolution designed for survival. If someone's behavior is inconsistent enough, your brain starts working harder to predict them. You begin thinking about them when they are not present. You replay conversations. You analyze tone. You search for meaning in small details. This mental loop feels like connection, but it is actually uncertainty. Psychologists often describe this as intermittent reinforcement, a pattern where rewards are given inconsistently enough to keep the brain engaged. It is the same mechanism behind gambling addiction. Not because people enjoy losing, but because the brain becomes trapped in the possibility of reward. A possible reward is more powerful than a guaranteed one. This is where emotional systems can be distorted. If someone gives you attention only sometimes, if they are warm, then distant, if they validate you, then withdraw, your brain becomes stuck in prediction mode, trying to solve them, trying to earn consistency, trying to restore stability. But that effort is not attraction. It is regulation. The nervous system is trying to stabilize an unstable pattern. This is why Stoic philosophy becomes so important here. Because Stoicism introduces something most modern psychology often ignores: self-governed attention. the ability to observe without becoming emotionally hijacked by every fluctuation in external behavior. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. What he meant is simple. Whatever you repeatedly focus on begins to shape your internal state. If your attention is constantly pulled toward unstable patterns, your emotional world becomes unstable. If your attention is grounded in clarity and consistency, your emotional world becomes steady. This is why the most powerful form of influence is not unpredictability. It is grounded presence. Consistency without rigidity. Awareness without performance. Calm attention without emotional manipulation. When you operate from that state, something subtle happens. People around you begin to relax. They stop trying to decode you. They stop guessing your reactions. They stop preparing for emotional shifts. And when the nervous system feels safe, it opens. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. And that is where real connection forms. Not through intensity, but through stability. The irony is that stability is often underestimated because it doesn't produce immediate emotional spikes. But long-term human bonds are not built on spikes. They are built on reliability. This is also where most people misunderstand attraction completely. They chase emotional highs, when in reality, long-term influence comes from emotional safety. The person who makes you feel slightly more understood each time you speak to them becomes more important than the person who overwhelms you occasionally with charm. One creates memory, the other creates noise. One compounds, the other burns out. This is why manipulation always collapses eventually. It depends on tension, and tension cannot sustain connection. Only attention can be sustained. But attention must be grounded in truth to remain stable. If it is built on inconsistency or control, it eventually fractures. People may not always recognize why they lose trust in someone, but their nervous system remembers. It registers the mismatch between expectation and emotional cost. Over time, that cost becomes too high, and the connection dissolves. This is why the ethical boundary matters. You cannot separate influence from responsibility. If you understand how attention works, you also inherit responsibility for how you affect others' psychological states. Do you leave people calmer or more anxious? Clearer or more confused? More grounded or more unstable? These are the real indicators of character, not how impressive you appear, but how regulated people feel in your presence. This is where psychology and Stoicism align completely. Both suggest that true power is not domination of others, but mastery of oneself. And from that mastery, influence becomes natural rather than forced. You don't need to manufacture attention. You simply stop disrupting it unnecessarily. And that alone is rare enough to be memorable. But understanding this principle is not enough, because knowledge without application remains abstract. The real transformation happens when you begin to apply it in everyday interactions. And that is where everything begins to change. How this principle changes everything. Once you understand how attention actually works, you stop seeing conversations the same way. You begin to notice something most people miss. It was never about saying the perfect thing. It was never about being the most confident person in the room. It was never about dominating social situations. It was about something much simpler. Reducing unnecessary friction in how people experience you. Because every interaction creates a feeling, not just thoughts, not just opinions, a feeling. And that feeling is shaped by one thing above all else: whether the other person's expectations were met, exceeded, or disrupted. Most people unknowingly create small forms of friction, interrupting without realizing it, responding without fully listening, shifting attention away mid-conversation, rushing to fill silence, trying to impress instead of understand. Individually, these seem insignificant, but the brain does not evaluate human connection in isolation. It evaluates patterns, and patterns compound. Now contrast that with something different. Someone who listens without rushing. Someone who remembers small details. Someone who doesn't compete for attention in the conversation. Someone who allows silence without discomfort. Someone who responds to what was meant, not just what was said. None of this feels dramatic, but it changes how people experience time around you. Time slows down, attention stabilizes, and the other person begins to feel something rare in modern life: psychological ease. This is where attraction quietly begins, not as excitement, but as relief. Because the modern world is overstimulated but under-attended. People are constantly exposed to information, but rarely truly seen. So when someone provides even a small sense of presence, the brain notices immediately, not consciously, but biologically. It marks the experience as important and begins to prioritize it in memory. This is the compound effect of attention. Small moments of genuine presence accumulate, not quickly, but deeply. One conversation where someone feels understood. Another where they feel heard without interruption. Another where they are not judged mid-sentence. Another where they don't have to perform to be accepted. None of these moments seem powerful alone, but together they reshape how you exist in someone's memory. And eventually, something subtle happens. People begin to associate your presence with clarity, with calmness, with understanding, with emotional stability. Not because you tried to project those qualities, but because you consistently created conditions where those qualities could exist. This is where influence becomes effortless. Not because you are doing more, but because you are interfering less with how people naturally want to experience connection. Now step back for a moment. Think about what most people are actually doing. Trying to be impressive, trying to be liked, trying to be memorable through effort. But effort alone does not create presence. In many cases, it destroys it, because it shifts focus away from the other person and back toward yourself. And human attention is sensitive to that shift. It can feel when something is being performed rather than experienced. That is why authenticity always feels lighter. It carries less psychological weight. There is less resistance in the interaction, less tension, less interpretation required, and more natural flow. This is what people are actually responding to when they say someone feels easy to talk to. Not intelligence, not status, not even confidence in the traditional sense, but the absence of unnecessary psychological noise. At this point, the principle becomes very simple. The people who are most memorable are not those who add the most to interactions, but those who remove the most friction from them. And that removal is what allows attention to settle. Once attention settles, trust forms. Once trust forms, memory strengthens. And once memory strengthens, influence emerges naturally, not as something you force, but as something that develops on its own. This is why chasing attraction directly often fails, because it reverses the order. You try to produce the outcome without creating the conditions that allow it. It is like trying to force a plant to grow by pulling on it. Growth does not respond to pressure. It responds to environment. And human connection is no different. If you create the right environment, attention stabilizes. If attention stabilizes, connection deepens. And if connection deepens, you become difficult to forget. Not because you are extraordinary, but because you are consistent in a world that is not. So the real question is not, how do I become more attractive? It is, what kind of experience do people have in my presence? Because that answer will determine everything else. Your relationships, your influence, your communication, and ultimately, how people remember you when you are no longer in the room. If there is one final idea to take from this, it is this. You are always teaching people what to expect from you. Every message, every conversation, every moment of attention or distraction. You are shaping a pattern in their mind, and over time, that pattern becomes your identity in their memory. So the question is not whether you are being noticed. It is what you are consistently teaching people to notice about you. If this video gave you a new way of seeing human behavior, consider subscribing to Silent Wisdom. We explore psychology, Stoicism, and the hidden systems behind how people think, act, and connect. And if you want to go deeper into these ideas, you'll find a recommended book in the description. It expands on many of the psychological principles we explored today and connects them to real-world behavior in a practical way. But more importantly, take this into your next interaction, not as a technique, but as awareness. Pay attention to how people feel in your presence, because in the end, that is what they will remember. People forget what you said. They remember how you made them feel.